to just kind of have the level-setting conversation about why is it that centralized markets and renewables go so well together? Why is it that we've looked to centralized markets to kind of help integration here? And Jim Bushnell, who's an economics professor at UC Davis and also a member of CAISO's Market Surveillance Committee, has graciously agreed to share his thoughts on that and set up a little bit of the conversation about carbon policy and markets for us. So I will turn it over, Jim, for you.
All right, thank you, Therese. So I was sitting in the back for the earlier sessions and could only see the tops of people's heads, so I'm going to stand at the podium to give this talk. I'm going to sit down if anybody asks a tough question. So this is meant to be kind of partly motivational speaking and partly kind of setting the table for the later, more deep dive discussions into how we deal with carbon flows across different state policies and so forth. So it's a forest talk, not a trees talk. I'm happy to talk about some trees offline at some point. So this is really divided into two parts. First is kind of the high-level discussion about what ISOs do and why we think it helps, and why it's even more critical in high renewable penetration environments. And then secondly, I want to talk about carbon regulation at the state level, which falls under the rubric of local regulations for global problems. And now we're going to have multiple local regulations, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues involved with that to try to tee up the subsequent discussions. All right, so independent system operators, to take this back sort of from a historical perspective, I think of the ISOs as really sort of an institution that was motivated to try to facilitate some form of competition amongst disaggregated buyers and sellers of power. For many years had tried to sort of create open access to grids, but unless there was an independent entity sort of enforcing and maintaining that open access, there was constant difficulties and fights over exactly what transmission capacity was available, when, and so forth. ISOs were seen as one solution to that problem, very much focused on what we call the vertical issue, separation of transmission from other parts of the business to try to facilitate some kind of competition. And in that sense, given the kind of motivational origins of ISOs, they were viewed with suspicion, I think, in parts of the country because they were associated with deregulatory policies, with sort of the more highly disaggregated types of market designs. And some states just didn't want any part of those types of policies, and they viewed ISOs as kind of linked to those types of policies, and so they viewed ISOs with suspicion. I think over time, what's happened is these entities have come to see that ISOs are not sort of synonymous with any type of particular market organization or deregulation. They can accommodate vertically integrated regulated utilities just as well as completely decentralized ones. And with this kind of acceptance, the acceptance of ISOs has grown, or at least the resistance to them has started to fade. So what do they do in a sense in order to facilitate this matching of supply and demand in a non-discriminatory way? They basically operate markets for supply and demand. We think of them as running markets. The ISO, I mean, at least in its original incarnation, was not supposed to be the market. It was supposed to be the reliability entity, and it still really is. But in the electricity world, because of the need to balance supply and demand constantly, it's pretty hard to disentangle the idea of reliability from the idea of at least balancing supply and demand. And when you have balancing supply and demand as part of the conversation, it starts to look a lot like a market, even if it may not be defined as a market by some definitions. So it runs, I have this in quotes, market software. It looks like a market. I mean, we have things that look like bids, and there are things that look like payments and stuff like that, but really it's a big engineering cost minimization problem. We're trying to minimize the cost of serving all customers, subject to making sure supply equals demand, transmission constraints, a bunch of other complicated stuff. And to the degree we think of this as a market in a more conventional sense, it really comes back to what is the economic regulation of the entities that are participating in the ISOs? Are they cost-based regulated? Are they completely deregulated, and anything in between? That sort of determines more of what conventional definitions of markets might think about. An important element here that we'll come back to is the fact that ISOs and other similar entities are what I will call a pool-based paradigm, in the sense that we're not bilaterally matching one seller to one buyer in an ISO-like market. Everybody's kind of pouring their power in, and we're valuing it based on when and where they're doing so, and they're taking the power out based upon when and where they're doing so. We're pricing it like that. There really wasn't a need to match a specific seller to a specific buyer until more recently, and that's where state policies will start to come in, and we'll start talking about it. It can be done, but because the optimization, the minimizing of cost doesn't really require matching of a single seller to a single buyer, there's somewhat of an arbitrary until you start defining some state-specific or buyer-specific objectives beyond what normally ISOs might consider. One last thing I want to add is, there was an interesting discussion about the economic versus state policies and where the sort of interaction was this morning. My personal view is ISOs, an attractive vision, at least to me, is that they're state policy neutral in the sense that they can accommodate a wide variety of state policies if done well, and facilitate them and make them implement more efficiently, but they're not necessarily the primary forum or mechanism for achieving those state policies. That's something we can come back to as well. So if you want to price carbon, great. I'm actually all in favor of that. And ISO-like markets are really good venues for doing so, but they don't necessarily, they're not the front lines for doing so. All right, a couple maps. Our colleague from Utah mentioned that if you look at maps, I'm going to get to a couple of those in a minute. So this is the obligatory. These are ISOs around the country. Here's the EIM. I noticed that I have to keep going back and updating my slides because it's growing so fast. And a couple notes about the EIM, that it is still somewhat of a unique entity that is not, at least what we would consider a full ISO by other ISO standards. It operates a real-time market. Now, there were some ISOs that were just real-time, but it handles currently only really a fraction of the transactions, a fraction of the available supply because of complicated rules about when transmission becomes available in the Western United States. It is voluntary, and that's an interesting dimension that maybe we could have more discussion about. There are lots of different ways you could sort of define voluntary, and I think how we define it does tend to influence exactly what we can get out of the EIM. And currently it's not integrated or co-optimized with reserves, so there are various margins here on this list that fully integrated ISOs generally deal with that are sort of issues that could still, or margins for which efficiency could still be gained from further integration or integration into a day-ahead-like setting that are part of ongoing discussion. All right, so how ISOs have helped. And thinking through this, some people have different lists, but I was trying to think about some of the big ticket items. And the one that usually comes to mind, it was the original motivation for an ISO. We want to make sure that the transmission grid is available to everybody in a non-discriminatory way. And it turns out in doing so, it moves us from a paradigm that was pretty kludgy, where we treated transmission wires like they were pipelines and could transact flows over specific lines in ways that we do with pipelines. It turns out that's very difficult and very inefficient to do in the electricity world. And so by moving towards an ISO-like system, it comes up with a much more efficient, much more transparent way of trying to allocate and sort of simultaneously consider the impacts on all of these pipelines, all of these transmission lines around the West in ways that can help to minimize overall costs. And it does facilitate trade. Some people like that. Some people are uncomfortable with it. But one aspect of actually getting more out of your infrastructure is that there's going to be flows throughout that infrastructure. My favorite one-slide illustration of this comes from a study of the PJM when they expanded into Ohio coming on 12 years ago, 15 years ago. And this is taken from a work from Aaron Manser and Matt White. The red line here is showing what happened when PJM expanded into Ohio in October of 2004. The blue line is flows over the Ohio PJM interface. The dots are the actual daily ones, and the blue lines are fit through those dots. And essentially what this picture is illustrating is in 2000, in the prior year to the PJM expansion, flows over this border averaged about 30 to 40 million kilowatt hours per day. And when the PJM expanded into Ohio, that roughly doubled, more than doubled, practically overnight. There was no physical addition to the infrastructure here, basically moving the paradigm for allocating the available physical capacity that was there away from a rather kludgy sort of way where you got to find the guy who's got your pipeline capacity and get him on the phone and put together a bundle of 3 or 4 transactions to one where it's kind of done through one big software optimization. And this opened up a lot of spare, or it unearthed a lot of slack capacity on this particular. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily an effect that's going to happen everywhere. There is other work that is sort of looking at this kind of thing. But it is my favorite illustration of the types of effects that transactions cost, this thing economists talk about, frictions, can really matter in terms of being able to utilize the infrastructure, which is really expensive, and so getting the most out of it really helps. All right, so allocating transmission capacity is the first. A second one, which has been, I think, really significant for the EIM, is just bringing a sort of normalized and transparent and systematic way of balancing even internal systems. So when there is a supply-demand balance, even internal to an electric control area, there are all sorts of ways that this has been done over the years. ISOs have a sort of somewhat standardized methods for doing so. It looks like a market, but it is also sort of just running standard engineering optimization. What it's done is bring a sort of harmonized set of systematic, and transparent rules for balancing to all of these entities that join, so everybody can kind of understand where the balancing is coming from, what these prices mean, if there is an imbalance, what the unit that's meeting that imbalance might be. That's both improved efficiency, which is where a lot of the statistics that have been calculated for savings are coming from, is just we're running our own internal systems better, in addition to the gains from trade we're having. But also, there's a lot more transparency to this. I'm going to come back to that because that's really important for renewable energy suppliers to understand exactly what they're going to pay for an imbalance and when, and I think that is an underappreciated element of ISO mark. The last topic, it's sort of an idea I'm workshopping here, so we'll see how you take it. That these are platforms for policy coordination, which is really what today is about. We have a group of disparate political bodies that have different sets of specific objectives. Sometimes they're harmonized, sometimes they're maybe a little bit in conflict with each other, but ISOs over the years, especially multi-state ones, have provided a natural forum when these issues affect the electric sector at least, for all these entities to try to get together and work things out. So that's why I call it the United Nations of Electric Utilities, the state regulators. You know, who's Russia and who's France, you can sort of work out what's going on there. But the idea is that there are a lot of interstate policy issues that require some type of harmonization with each other, and ISOs have provided a really natural place for these to come together. There are other, regional planning bodies that also serve this purpose, but I do think it is one thing that the ISOs also provide. All right, those are some of the good things about ISOs. Even if you didn't want to expand your renewable penetration, I think there's a lot to be argued for them. I can say a few bad things about ISOs, but I'm short on time. Later on, they just try so darn hard, So I do want to talk a little bit about the high renewable penetration aspects of this, and this is already mentioned this morning, so I'll try to go quickly through a couple of these. need to take advantage of resource diversity. So the most obvious one is that the wind blows at different times in different places on average. Unfortunately, the sun shines more or less at the same, we can gain an hour or two in one direction or another, but we get less diversity out of that until we connect to South America and or the other side of the world. So taking advantage of this diversity is something that I think is going to be really important when we start talking about really, really high levels of penetration, and that means more efficient ways of shipping power over long distances. Now, it's not like trade didn't happen before ISOs. It did. It's not like these physical connections weren't there. It's just, as I've been talking about, we tend to allocate that scarce transmission capacity in a much more rationalized and effective way. It's happening under a single optimal umbrella. Another aspect of resource diversity is just the fact that we can share the reserve requirements over broader regions. That does help, and I think that becomes more important again as we have intermittency causing different types of reserve needs over time. All right, so a couple pictures. This is just hourly system average. This is already becoming quaintly outdated. So this is some work I've been doing studying the impact of CAISO's utility scale renewable expansion, which dramatically grew between 2012 and 2016. This is just illustrating over the course of the full year, the hour-of-day average output of solar, utility-scale solar on the CAISO system. It's this big mountain that shows up as we've grown from about 500 to over 6,500 megawatt hours, and that's now up to something like 10,500 now. That's why it's already becoming a little quaintly outdated. Don't tell my referees. And one of the implications of this is I'm contractually obligated to show you a duck curve. This is a slightly different duck curve. This is the imports into the CAISO system. The blue line is 2012. It sort of follows load. It's what we would expect trade flow to look like. The red line is 2016. Again, it's sort of the inverse of what's happening with the solar. As that solar has ramped up, we've imported a lot less energy from neighboring states. We do less of some other things, too, to offset that energy. Now, notice it's still bottoming out about 6,000 megawatts in 2016, which I always thought was a little curious. We had some zero or almost negative price hours. But over time, that is adjusted. I was sort of just looking at more recent data, which I'll show you, and these imports are becoming much closer to zero. All right, so that's kind of the long-run average effects, but one of the things I wanted to talk about beyond that is the fact that these are not necessarily predictable. They are predictable in aggregate, like it doesn't surprise us if the sun shines during the day, but from a day-to-day basis, there is a lot of volatility still with that. And unlike bilateral long-term contractual arrangements, ISOs are better at dealing with, I'll call them last-minute transactions, but it's really meant to be, day-to-day transactions of some kind where things happen, storms hit parts of the regions and so forth, and ISOs are just better at adjusting to changing daily conditions than bilateral markets tend to be. So here's an example I pulled off of Oasis, or the CAISO website just the other day. This is January 21st. It's a Monday, and this kind of looks like the typical pattern. The green line is renewable, so there's a lot of solar hitting the up to 14,000 on this day. Imports are dropping almost, that's the solid burgundy line, are dropping to 1,000 or lower, and so imports are much lower in this low demand January day. But if you go back just 1 week, where I assume it was stormy, the solar production on January 14th, again a Monday, was about a third of what it was 1 week later, I assume again because there were storms going on. And a lot of that difference was made up from a much higher level of imports coming into the CAISO system. And you can see these lines are pretty jaggedy as well. So these are not smooth 1 hour, 6 hour blocks of flows. These are things that are bouncing up and down pretty continuously, which is something that requires both a integration that can adjust on a 15-minute and 5-minute basis, as well as one that can move flexibly on a day-to-day basis as well. All right, so last, the need for transparency and efficiency in balancing services. There was a period, I think it's almost 10 years ago, when renewable developers in the western U.S. were trying to do something called dynamically schedule their energy into California, in part because they're balancing would be treated under CAISO balancing markets, very transparent. They could sort of model and predict and hedge what their balancing costs would be. In a lot of other parts of non-ISO markets, you basically have to contract with your local operator to do some kind of balancing services, which sometimes can be very transparent, but they're not necessarily very flexible, not always transparent, and that tends to put some small taxes on investment, location, and planning when you don't exactly know what the economics of an imbalance are going to look like. And there's a revealed preference to all these Western projects wanting to spend money to dynamically schedule into the CAISO system to get access to a real-time balancing market that sort of reveals that there's a preference there for developing renewables and knowing exactly what the economic conditions of dealing with fluctuations would be. All right, in about 7 minutes, I'm going to try to talk about carbon regulation and queue up the subsequent discussion. This is a topic I've thought about quite a bit in a lot of different contexts, but I want to think about it in the electricity context. I just want to define it. Here's the map that was going to be motivated. All right, so this, and everybody has different sort of versions of this, but these are maps of somebody's, I forget where I got it, policy active states. Tend to be coastal states where there's some kind of carbon cap and trade or carbon standard of some kind going on. This is juxtaposed with this picture, thanks to PG&E for letting me steal this picture a long time ago, where the power plants, this illustrates where the carbon in the electric sector is. And just sort of juxtaposing these pictures with each other, one of the things that pops out is you can see the states with carbon regulations on this map because they're not covered in black circles. And that tells us the challenge of carbon regulation at many different levels, that the areas in which the most sort of active carbon regulations are happening are not the areas where the most carbon emissions power sector, at least our transport's a different matter. And so this was sort of an image that was etched on the mind of California policymakers, certainly when they were trying to develop ideas for how to deal with electricity under AB 32 and other policies. And it's still sort of a fundamental problem with trying to do climate regulation in general, certainly at the state level. All right, so to just establish some jargon that I think we're going to probably revisit here, apologies to the subsequent panelists if I use slightly different jargon. There's a couple ways to try to deal with measuring emissions, point of regulation it's been called. One we'll call upstream or the source, where we're essentially regulating the smokestack or regulating, could actually go upstream to the mine or the source of the fuel at some way or another. But the idea is at the point where the supply is created is where you're doing the regulation. The concerns of this type of more traditional point of regulation there are others, but two of the big ones are leakage and I'll just call it ineffectiveness. So leakage is the classic case of we're going to reduce our output from our local source that's being regulated, and we're either going to move our factory, move our fertilizer plant, or dispatch down our power plant in the state and dispatch up a power plant someplace else, where the someplace else is not subject to the same amount or same strictness of carbon regulation. And then we're going to re-import the product of one kind or another. And so that's a classic form of leakage where we're essentially kind of chasing out the pollution, but it's not going away. This is okay if we're dealing with smog or other local pollutants. Well, it's a different issue. Where for a global pollutant, it's problematic because we're not really helping the end product issue, climate change. There's some issues here where some climate policies can subsidize what I'll call not low carbon but medium carbon sources like natural gas through certain types of intensity standards, and that becomes another complication because they're in essence subsidizing the production of medium stuff that could then be exported to other states. This is a big concern under the Clean Power Plan, which I guess we don't have to worry about right now, but when we had state level intensity standards, it was something that we would have to focus on. All right, the ineffectiveness part is that map. If we want to regulate the carbon emissions from the power sector and we're Washington State or California or Oregon, there just isn't that much carbon in the state. Even though we are sort of responsible for a lot more carbon by consuming a lot of electricity, we don't have direct reach over a lot of sources in the state. And if we're limiting our regulations just to those sources, there's that concern. So an alternative, if you are a state with a lot of consumers, which California tends to be, is to focus the regulation on the consumption of the product. You could call that import or downstream regulation, or in electricity CARB world, it's first deliverer, where we're regulating the importer of the electricity that comes in. This creates some issues. We have to trace the source of the power that's flowing over the border back to some external source. And electricity, that's often a term of art as well as physics. Because electricity markets, or electricity systems, I should say, operate as pools. So this raises issues for pool-based markets, which, as I said, did not, as a rule, track source-specific and customer-specific transactions. They can, and we do under EIM, but there's, constant discussions about exactly that. So there are a couple issues that are analogous to leakage that we would see. One is what is sometimes called reshuffling or shuffling, and the other is relabeling. Relabeling, just to sort of lay out my definitions of these things, is when we're bringing in, say you're California, but you're bringing in a dirty source, you're bringing in power from the same source, but now it's instead of saying it's coming from a specific power plant, you're saying it's coming from a system or a generic source or unspecified, some of the terminology. This strategy can be appealing if the unspecified source is deemed cleaner than the thing you were buying from earlier. So if you used to be importing from a coal plant, and you continue importing from a coal plant, there's concerns if you could just say, oh, I don't know where it's coming from, if that unspecified regulation is cleaner. So that's distinct from reshuffling, where you're not buying from the same source. You actually are switching the source you're buying from, but the new source might be clean, so you're purchasing from the new source, but the source that you no longer buying from continues to sell to somebody else outside of your jurisdiction. And so the concern with reshuffling is you're just swapping sources. The overall production in, say, the western United States doesn't change. It's just who sort of takes the delivery of that power, at least on paper, has changed. And so these are real concerns that have sort of befuddled us for many, many years. One thing to note that I think is underappreciated is that when we kind of clamp down on one of these problems, like say, let's just make the generic emissions rate on all unspecified power really dirty, so nobody wants to relabel to unspecified. If we did that, then that just makes the incentive to actually seek out and find zero carbon resources to then claim as imports into the state even stronger. And so trying to deal with one problem can kind of create a bit of a waterbed effect by pushing some of the activity into other problems. A couple of quick pictures. California, this is why these topics on this slide are part of the discussion in California right now. Since 2008, we've seen a steady decline of carbon emissions. The red line is when our cap and trade market came in. These are issues that are affected by cap and trade, but they're affected by all sorts of regulations as well, RPS and other things, as we will discuss. The carbon reductions in California, especially since about 2012, have been coming pretty much from the power sector. And a big chunk of those, not all of them, we've reduced our in-state emissions quite a bit, and we've reduced our imports also quite a bit. So the overall solid blue line is the total electricity emissions. The tealish line is in-state, and the gray line is imports. And depending on how you squint, you could argue imports are declining faster. I just actually looked at 2017 data, and the in-state went very far down, so the blue line was dropping very fast. A couple ways to think about this. This picture illustrates the emissions rate, or the emissions divided by the amount of power flowing, at least our estimate of it. For a power flowing into California, the dark blue lines are the emissions rates for power plants that are the rest, that are generating power that's not going to California. And when you squint at this picture, it kind of looks like the emissions rates going into California are declining faster than the rest of the West. I don't want to say this is definitive. This is sort of a ballpark estimate of it. If we think of this in terms of coal, well, the blue lines are, again, the change in coal output out of the state, and the green lines are the amount that's attributed to California imports. And there we've seen a big reduction in coal production outside of California, and only a modest reduction in the amount of that is declared as deemed delivered into California. All right, so that's just kind of trying to illustrate that these are issues that we continue to worry about to some degree, but I do want to make the point that there isn't a perfect way to deal with any of these. It's just sort of a fundamental challenge of trying to deal with a global environmental problem when you don't have regulatory jurisdiction over all of the sources. And so reducing the efficiency of the economy overall or of our electric system to combat specific import problems, I do believe would be long-run counterproductive. Sort of trying to isolate ourselves also can reduce the ability to try to have these regional discussions as well. So we do need to balance the concerns over how we deal with these specific problems with what it does to the actual operations of the electric system itself, both in terms of cost and the other dimensions. The EIM itself, I think, has come under a lot of scrutiny, in part because of its very transparency. So these incentives for things like shuffling and relabeling that I've been talking about, they're not limited to just the EIM. The EIM is something that makes it extremely transparent, and I think is one of the reasons why it's kind of become the focal point of some of these issues. But I do think if we found a way to completely eliminate these issues inside the EIM, it would not resolve them. It would sort of push that activity into day-ahead schedules, for example. And if we didn't have a day-ahead, if we did have a day-ahead EIM, it would probably push them into longer-term contracts. So we have to kind of keep in mind that just because we can see it happening here, does not necessarily mean that it's the only place where it might be happening. And then the point I made earlier, that precise regulation of one import problem, especially I think it's very key if we think about the unspecified shuffling issue. If we treated every import into California, no matter where it came from, as just unspecified, there's no incentive to reshuffle then. Because even if I bought from a hydro plant or a new renewable plant, I'd still have to pay the unspecified source. Solves one problem, creates another problem. And so there are these sort of balancing of solutions to these problems that we do also need to keep in mind. All right, I meant to just use that to tee these issues up. Mark's going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of that. And I only went 5 minutes over time, so thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Jim. Actually, and you started a little late, so I actually think you timed it perfectly. And so now, Mark Rossleader will talk to us about the current approach to GHG accounting, and Mark is the Vice President of Market Quality and Renewable Integration at the California ISO.
Thank you. I think I enjoyed the earlier discussion. Jim, thank you for setting my discussion up as well. I think you did a very good job of explaining some of the background. So as an ISO, I think as Jim pointed out, we do certain things, try to do certain things in terms of try to achieve an efficient dispatch, respecting certain constraints. So that's minimizing cost to serve demand, subject to those transmission constraints and all those things. In terms of EIM, and let me back up a little bit. We have been doing that since really when we started in the market, and then we updated our market in 2009. And in that regard, cost minimization was basically bid cost minimization. People bid in to this market, presumably bidding their fuel costs and their marginal costs of operation, and we minimize those costs. And then when cap and trade program became live in California, being that that cost of compliance of cap and trade could be incorporated into the bids, we recognize that we can actually incorporate that cost of GHG compliance into the dispatch. And that's exactly what we did and how we basically supported state policy. We didn't create state policy, but we did support state policy in terms of trying to now incorporate that GHG cost into the dispatch. So resources internal to California effectively now have the ability to incorporate the GHG costs into their bid. They don't do it as a bid adder. It's just incorporated into their bid. And that is the way it is in California because the entire production or GHG impact of those internal resources have a compliance obligation, regardless whether it stays in state or not. And so as a result of that, they don't need a bid adder. It's just incorporated into the bid itself. On the import side, in order to really quantify and account for all the GHG effects and the costs associated with serving load in California, we have to also account for those imports. And there's multiple mechanisms to do that. One is, as you heard earlier, specified resources are responsible and they can specify their, or be responsible at their specific emissions rate. But they have to be known resources, contracted, and they have to qualify as specified resources. And it does follow the tag, then the tagged energy that is transacted or imported into California is the quantity they're responsible for. If you're not a specified resource, imports into California that are tagged are responsible for compliance based on a default emissions rate, 0.428 metric tons per megawatt hour. And that default emissions rate and the cost of compliance based on that default emissions rate is what those importers will incorporate into their bid or their costs of serving load in California because they're an import or a tagged import to California. The third mechanism is what's called asset controlling supplier, and certain balancing areas or certain asset controlling suppliers external can make the case that, hey, their average emissions rate is something less than the unspecified resource rate. It's also not a specified resource because they've got a portfolio of resources, but in aggregate, that portfolio that controlling supplier controls, they can basically request and negotiate effectively an average emissions rate that represents their emissions rate for their resources that they control. So up to this point, I'm talking about everything that is really non-EIM. So those imports are all, the basis of that is what is tagged as imports into California. The third and the new kid on the block is with the introduction of the energy imbalance market, we had a decision to make or a design to try to develop, and that is how are we going to track and account for emissions on resources that are participating in the energy imbalance market. And different from a generic tag where you don't know the resource behind that tag, the energy imbalance market, the basis of the energy imbalance market is that we are doing resource-specific dispatch external to California. Now, those resources external to California are not strictly importing into California. They're not strictly serving load in California. They could be serving load external to California in a non-GHG compliance area. So as a result of that, the first thing we did was, we said, we're going to track this on a resource-specific basis because we wanted to get transparency and we wanted to account for these resources on a resource-specific basis because we were doing specific resource dispatch. The next thing was, well, how do we do this if these resources have both responsibility potentially of serving load externally and potentially serving load in California? So we created this mechanism which is called the GHG bid adder, which allowed these resources to say, okay, if I'm serving load in California, this is the additional cost to serve load in California because that's effectively going to be my compliance costs because if I'm deemed or determined to be serving load in California, I have a compliance obligation to California. And that is a voluntary decision. They can say, well, you know what, none of my output is available for California use, in which case there's no bid adder because they can't be deemed or determined to serve load in California. Nonetheless, so the bid adder basically only acts on that resource if it is optimized to serve load in California. If it's not serving load in California, it's basically whatever the rest of the bid is for that resource, less the bid adder. Okay. The other thing to point out on EIM is an intra-hour optimized dispatch. And before EIM, the way transactions happen between balancing areas, they would be done on an hourly basis. And once your hourly transactions were set up with your neighbor, there was no way to effectively transact with your neighbor, even though there was economic opportunities to serve your load from a less expensive resource, or have an opportunity to sell your energy to a higher price market and get that value of opportunity. EIM creates an efficient dispatch intra-hour. That said, it's only acting on maybe a 3 to 5% of the volume of energy load served, because most of that is already set up bilaterally, self-scheduled, or in the case of the ISO, done through the day-ahead market. So you're only talking about the kind of the deviations from what your plan was leading up into the real-time market. Okay, so I'm just going to dive just a bit deeper into this how do we optimize this and what's the implications of the optimization using this bid adder. And I know this is a busy slide, but stick with me here for a second. So effectively, you've got California resources, and their fuel cost is basically $30. The GHG cost of those resources, actually both internal and external, are $5 additional. We have load in California, we have load externally. I won't get into how much of that is, but when we are optimizing this, we are basically saying if that external resource is determined or serving load in California, its cost of doing so is the energy bid cost plus its $5 adder. Effectively, what ends up happening then if that resource is optimized to serve load in California, then effectively what you have is a constraint that's set up where California prices are effectively set at $35, either because of the resource in California or because of the external resource, $30 plus $5 bid, and you've got now a higher price energy that load in California is serving and paying for. Externally, we still have to maintain that the external load is not exposed to those GHG costs at this point, because there's no GHG policy for serving load externally. So we effectively take that shadow price, that $5 difference, and we subtract it from the external price, and that creates the LMP externally, which is the $30 external price. So now we have an extra $5 that we've collected from California load. Some of that is going to the resource that's in California that was dispatched to meet the demand, but also $5 is going to specifically the resource that has been deemed or attributed to serve load in California. And the reason we do that is because that resource was attributed and determined optimally to serve load in California, it has a compliance obligation and a cost, and that $5 is effectively covering its costs. So at the end of the day, this simplifies to the fact that California, where the GHG policy exists, is absorbing the cost of the GHG. Specific resources that are determined to serve that load have the compliance obligation, and they will take that money and convert it and get a compliance instrument that they then basically turn into CARB. That's how the mechanism works. And this allows us to do things on a resource-specific basis, and it allows us to also recognize that we're not trying to impose this GHG policy on external dispatcher prices externally. Now, as Jim and everybody else kind of alluded to, there is not a perfect solution to this. Anytime you have a GHG area, a compliance area, where you're considering the cost of GHG in the dispatch, and then an area that you're not, and you're allowing transfers in between for efficient dispatch sake, you are not able to get to a perfect solution where you can perfectly account for all the GHG from the dispatch of those resources. And there's kind of the more you try to do that, the more you potentially are impacting efficient dispatch. When you try to strive to account for everything perfectly, you may start impeding efficient dispatch. So this is a balancing act that that has to be struck. So there are GHG policies. Again, we don't make these policies, but we try to support these policies. And different policies and different nuances of the GHG policies have different effects on the dispatch and the efficient dispatch of the market. And I'll just kind of go through these. There's probably more of these. These are the ones that I highlight from what I've seen, my experience with EIM and non-EIM dispatch. So cap and trade deals with allowances, whereas a tax would be dealt with in terms of dollars or costs. If you do it with allowances, you can kind of abstract it in a way that, well, if I get an allowance and there's a linkable GHG policy across different areas, an allowance from one area will count for an allowance in another area. Doesn't mean that the cost of that allowance is necessarily the same, but it allows you to get the allowance and kind of take the price of that allowance out of the decision. Doesn't mean that the cost of the allowance doesn't still enter the dispatch, but allows individuals to really individually determine what their cost of that allowance is. They can trade it, they can determine the allowance cost, but once they do that, they can incorporate that cost into the dispatch. A tax, on the other hand, could theoretically be incorporated into dispatch, but I think it goes to the second point of this, and that is, where is the point of regulation? Now, if you do a tax or a cost, a specific price, and then the question is, well, do you have challenges because you have different prices in different regions, and how do you then track that, and do you have to account for the fact that if I'm importing into one area, it's going to be one price, whereas if I'm importing into another area, it's another price. And that really conflates and complicates this notion of a bid adder. You start to have a creation where you have as many bid adders as you have different GHG price areas that you may be importing to. The point of regulation, and I think I appreciate Jim's notion that it could be supplier, source, it could be first deliverers. I put in here end users because the point of regulation could be on the end users themselves. The way the cap and trade works in California, it's on suppliers or the first deliverers, but that allows those deliverers or the suppliers to incorporate that into their bid. Whereas if you put the point of regulation on end users, the end users don't know really how their energies are being met unless it's through some kind of contractual or self-supplied declaration mechanism. But at that point, that mechanism doesn't lend itself to incorporating that into the dispatch itself. There is one exception of this, and I want to point it out because we talk about renewable energy credits. In a way, renewable energy credits do factor into our dispatch, but I don't have to track, at least in California, where that renewable energy credit is going. And so it does factor into the dispatch because a renewable resource can incorporate the value of that renewable energy credit into their bid price. Well, that's why some renewable resources will bid negative, because that's the cost, lost opportunity of not generating from that resource. But I don't track where that renewable resource is going, what load it's serving. It's that if they're contracted with that resource and that resource is producing, they effectively can get the renewable energy credit itself. And that kind of brings us to the last bullet point, and that is there's this interplay between renewable energy credit and the optimization. If you decouple those, in other words, you really don't care where the energy from that resource that has a renewable energy credit is going. What you care about is how it's contracted and whether it's delivering at all and how much it's delivering. If you decouple that, you don't have to track where the renewable resources are going and what load they're serving. However, if you couple it and you say, well, in order for you to get the credit from that renewable energy and count it towards meeting your load, and then you have to couple that together, and then it becomes a challenge because it says, well, does that impede the ability of that resource to offer its capability up to serve load externally? And from a GHG policy and tracking perspective, because renewable energy credits and GHG policy, if they're decoupled, can go separately. We can do GHG policy and tracking separate from RECs. If they're coupled together, you get into the concern that exists sometimes where a renewable resource, if it is attributed to serve load in California because of the GHG, somehow it then loses its renewable energy credit for the entity who has contracted for that. And that creates a challenge and may impede the ability of those resources to participate in a regional market like an energy imbalance market. So that's the coupling effect. So with all that said, I guess I view this as a kind of a spectrum where things would be really simple, and I'm not suggesting that this is reality, but if there was just a single region across the interconnection where there was a single GHG allowance policy or GHG price, and the point of regulation was on suppliers, this would be fairly simple. We could just use our optimization and we can do cost minimization considering the GHG costs of all those resources. And there would be compliance obligations on those resources, and they would satisfy that. And we wouldn't have to track where those resources were going from one area to another, because it would all be a point of regulation on the supplier or the production. Where we are today is something in between. And you basically have an area, currently it's California has a GHG policy, and then the rest of the West does not. And I know there's the policies developing, and as those policies develop, we might be able to link areas together to have an efficient dispatch, but if we can link them together, we can basically have two areas, a GHG compliance area and a non-GHG area, and then all we have to do is, the complication is we have to track what's going in between and how do we track the energy going from the non-GHG compliance area to the GHG compliance area. And there's multiple choices. We can do things like tagging like we have for non-EIM transactions, or we can try to go down the road of a resource-specific, source-specific type dispatch and tracking like we have in EIM. Or there's other mechanisms that we could consider. We can introduce a common rate for any transfers between the non-GHG area and the GH area. There's trade-offs in trying to do that. At the far end of the spectrum is you have multiple GHG regions. Some are linkable, some are not. To the extent they're not linkable and you have multiple GHG regions, then the question you have to start asking yourself is, how do we track, or does it even need tracking of resources and how you're serving load from one area from resources in another area? Is that the mechanism? And if it's, where's the point of regulation? If you have many different approaches here, it becomes very difficult to figure out how to do this and optimize transfers between those areas and not and still achieve the efficient dispatch. So at the end of the day, I would hope and I would like to strive for, even if the GHG policies are different, if they're linkable in some way, that we can at least electrical system level dispatch sort of like in the middle, with or without a GHG policy. That would probably be realistically the best place we can be. If we go to the far right, I think that's where we're going to be challenged, and we could start to lose the benefits or lose the ability of efficient dispatch and the benefits of things like EIM. So I'll just close with this, and that is this kind of, you've seen graphs all day, but this is, one of the benefits of starting to incorporate GHG emissions into the dispatch is you can start tracking these things about what is the GHG emissions, total emissions, to serve your load. And in the case of ISO, we've been doing this, and we've tracked it back to 2014. We see that we've reduced emissions by about 26% from 2014 levels since we started to be able to track this. Now, I'm not claiming this is because of EIM. Part of this may be because of EIM, but a large portion of this is because you've got the large amount of renewables coming into the system and they're displacing emitting resources. From year to year, from season to season, you'll get different patterns. If it's a low hydro year, if something pointed out earlier, you should have higher emissions result. But as you continue to grow the renewable resources, you'll see this continue. And one thing I'll just close on this is that we talked about a lot of things about tracking serving load in California. One of the benefits of the EIM too, that I don't think we get credit for, is when we are exporting, when we have that oversupply condition. And in the middle of the day, when you have too much solar and we are able to economically displace other resources outside the area. When that happens, there's not a credit for the reduction of GHG in those other areas that exist in the GHG accounting and policy. But it does exist, and we should recognize that that is a benefit, even though we don't account for it and track it. So we'll close with that, and we'll be prepared for questions.
Terrific. Thanks, Mark. So here's what we're going to do. This is going to probably, for those of you that have questions, it's going to feel frustrating right now, but we're going to go ahead and take the break that's scheduled from 2 to 2:15. Mark and Jim are going to sit up here for the next panel as well. So if you look at the agenda, we've dedicated a significant amount of time to questions because we think each of the presenters have really unique perspectives to share. So we're going to take a break. I'm going to ask you to come back on time. And we're going to start with the stakeholder panel, and then you'll be able to ask Jim and Mark some questions as well. 2:15. Thanks so much. Okay, 2:15, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those in the room, if you can go ahead and take your seats. Those in the room, if you can end your conversation and take your seats, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, we're going to transition to our stakeholder panel, and this is, this is an exciting part of this process. We thought it would be really interesting to hear from market participants and stakeholders about the things they've been thinking about when you have multiple states with carbon counting or carbon reduction policies. So what we have here is a fairly diverse set of folks. That was by design. We've given them the challenge of only speaking for 5 minutes. We're going to set that challenge for them. The reason for that is we do want to get to a point where we have a lot of question and answer. So we're going to have each of them go, give their presentation. Again, no question and answer until the end. And what you can see is that we've tried to leave a lot of time for question and answer at the end. We're going to start with Mary Winke from Pacificor, and we are going to ask them to come to the podium because it looks like it is easier for you to see them. Okay. PowerPoint. Oh. Let's incorporate it. Oh. No? Oh, there we go. Okay, great.
Thanks, Therese. I'm Mary Winke from Pacificor. I work on market and environmental policy, so I'm interested in the intersections of those things, which is what we're all talking about today, so it's very exciting for me. I am going to kind of try to set the stage for the rest of the panel and quickly run through some high-level topics in 5 minutes or less. And I actually think that a lot of the themes that I wanted to cover today, which are really kind of 4 key points, have already really been covered quite succinctly by the last 2 panelists. And, you know, the upshot of kind of the problem statement in my mind is really this challenge or this tension between achieving the benefits of a more organized market or a more regionalized market, while also at the same time having state policies that are really requiring a lot of granularity in terms of figuring out what resources and what emissions are serving load in each state. We have a lot of, the organized markets, as Mr. Bushnell was talking about, don't easily lend themselves to identifying or tagging certain resources to certain loads. However, in order to achieve the policy goals that you heard articulated earlier, I think Colin was talking about, accuracy, verification, consistency, all these types of things with respect to their program. You need to have a level of certainty about what emissions are attributed to or what types of energy are attributed to each state. So there's some tension there in terms of moving on the one hand toward a market with fewer themes and more efficiency with this need to sort of identify where all the energy is going. So I'm going to give very quickly just some kind of specific examples from PacifiCorp's experience that I think kind of highlight some of these key themes. The first one that, as we've already talked about, EIM is largely seen as successful in integrating greater numbers of renewables. And for PacifiCorp has enabled a stepwise reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions that has been consistent since 2016. So, this harnessing kind of this geographic load diversity and resource variation is also going to become increasingly important as we move toward a decarbonized electric system. So as we've been talking about, as you heard the states talk about, we have states that have REC-based and load-based accounting systems for their RPSs. California, Oregon, New Mexico, Nevada, and Washington all have REC-based RPS programs. In Nevada, it's a portfolio energy credit, which is a little different, though I'm not quite aware of the distinctions in there. We can talk to our friends in Nevada afterwards. As we report right now, undifferentiated power from the market doesn't count. You don't have a REC associated with that energy that's coming onto our system, so it doesn't count for the RPS. If you're going to a place where you're in a more organized market where those imports don't count, it becomes problematic, at least in Washington, if you're getting higher than 20% of your load service from an organized market. And then California, Oregon, and Washington also have emissions reporting requirements. As we talked about, they haven't all gone to sort of a full regulation of those emissions, but all of those require reporting of emissions. And as Mark was talking about, EIM transfers to California are resource specific, but EIM transfers, as we report them to Washington and Oregon, are unspecified imports. So again, with varying default emission factors applied to those imports. I think the next bullet we've kind of gotten to, and we've heard from others that resources are not dispatched to serve certain loads. And PacifiCorp's sort of multi-state system is a little bit of a microcosm of this broader issue. That PacifiCorp, the reason PacifiCorp exists as a multi-state utility is that there's a lot of benefits in linking up the Rocky Mountain states and the Western states in terms of when they have peak load and when they have resources available. So there's a significant amount of benefit realized by our entire system by operating as a system. But what that means is we can't dispatch resources to serve one state. And I think overall, the theme from my perspective is we want to avoid unintended consequences. And I think some of the potential unintended consequences of having accounting systems that aren't consistent with each other and accounting systems that can frustrate further market participation. You have potentially disincentives to participate in the market at all. You potentially have underutilization of existing resources and transmission. potential costly overbuild of renewable resources. If each state kind of has to go on their own, it could be much more costly to decarbonize our system than it otherwise would be if we could rely on our neighbors. And then potentially market signals that don't incentivize the behavior that a particular policy is designed to incentivize. So I think Jordan or somebody said earlier that you know, we really need to figure out sort of what our goals are and then go from there. And I very much agree with that. I think that our goals are actually very consistent. You know, we largely agree that due to either state policies or economics, we're moving toward a decarbonized grid, and we'd like to do it as efficiently as possible. So with that, I probably even went over my 5 minutes, so I will.
You did well, Mary, thanks. Okay, so next we have Todd Jones from the Center for Resource Solutions.
Okay, 5 minutes. I can do it. Okay. Thank you. My name is Todd Jones. I'm the Policy Director with the Center for Resource Solutions. Today I'm going to address the impacts of inconsistent policies within and across states. So the headline is that inconsistency between state programs is affecting participation in the EIM and the ability of the market to efficiently develop renewables. So different GHG and renewable energy accounting regimes in different states can be categorized in different ways. And Professor Bushnell said upstream, downstream. I'm going to say source-based, load-based, but I mean the same thing. So source-based policies measure and regulate what's generated at the source. The point of regulation is often the generator. Load-based policies, Glenn also called these consumption-based policies, measure and regulate what's consumed, delivered, sold, serving load in a particular place. And the point of regulation is often the supplier, LSE, deliverer. And so to be clear, if we're talking about renewable energy or emissions, both types of policies measure and regulate generation attributes. And attributes, the fuel type, the emissions, are one, separate from energy, and two, not physically delivered. All electricity is indistinguishable on the grid, and attributes don't move. So the GHG accounting for source-based is very simple. You measure emissions at the smokestack, and those emissions are assigned to that source. The GHG accounting for load-based requires a contractual tracking instrument or method. And so this map shows the current landscape of source-based and load-based policies in the West. And electricity is obviously transacted across all of these state and programmatic schemes. There's different accounting methodologies for all of these programs, even within load-based policies. So, for example, differences between power source disclosure and RPS and IRP GHG targets in California, all of which are load-based. But in general, policymakers and regulated entities and market participants all need sort of clarification on what is being transacted, the attributes of what's being transacted, and what programs are measuring, how they relate to each other. And we need consistency among programs that are measuring the same thing, particularly among consumer-facing programs. The rules for consumer-facing programs should be the same. I just want to make a few points about the broad theme of the panel, this disconnect between market and state policy. So first, you can have both source-based and load-based policies with an organized market. Second, all load-based policies require a tracking or accounting instrument for allocation or some sort of allocation methodology for the attributes. And there is a separate system for tracking renewable energy attributes. That's REX or REGIS for the purposes of tracking and verifying delivery of specified renewable power to end users for compliance with the state RPS programs, Washington's new Clean Energy Transformation Act, and for voluntary renewable energy procurement products. If we didn't use REX, we'd have to use something else. And so one question that's being asked is, do these policies pose sort of a fundamental problem for regional organized market? And to that, I'd say, one, it's okay to have a separate system for tracking attributes. And CAISO has recognized that generation attributes are separate when it comes to the EIM. And two, negative impacts on the market from load-based state policies are due to policy design elements that have to do with market boundaries and bundling of attributes to power, not necessarily the accounting instrument or the REC. If states are mandating delivery of specified power or power with specified emissions to a certain state, or if they're putting a price on emissions coming into the state and providing an economic advantage for zero emissions deliveries to their state, whether the state uses RECs to verify those specified deliveries or not, if they're tracking attributes with the delivered energy, like California, or if they're requiring bundling of RECs with energy, like Washington is for 80%, then that's the same thing. That limits the size of the market, not the accounting instrument. So I would say RECs aren't the problem necessarily. And there may be circumstances where state policy might result in what Mary called sort of overbuild in a certain region, and that's just state programs making the regional market smaller. But it doesn't have to do with RECs specifically, no REC-based policy. So the patchwork of programs and accounting regimes in place in California and across the West is sort of causing confusion and increasing the risk of double counting. And I just want to highlight one example relevant to the EIM that I first introduced to this forum in September of 2017. So California's cap and trade covers the emissions associated with imported electricity. California's mandatory reporting rule for cap and trade does not require that the RECs associated with imported renewable power be imported with that power in order for CARB to assign the specified emissions factor of the renewable generated to that power. So those RECs could be used in RPS or other programs in neighboring states to verify transactions of the same renewable or zero emissions power to those states. So CARB's assignment of emissions to power is inconsistent with other load-based state programs, which use the REC system for tracking attributes. So having these two different mechanisms for tracking delivery of attributes in a region creates this risk of double counting. So for example, the state of Washington passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act. We heard talk about that this morning. It requires 100% carbon-free power for Washington customers, and it uses RECs as the compliance mechanism for verifying delivery of renewable carbon-free power to customers. This is in direct conflict with California's policy under the MRR and potentially affecting the same megawatt hour. So this illustration shows either a direct delivery from a Washington wind facility to California, or it could be an EIM resource in Washington that's deemed delivered to California as a specified renewable resource. In either case, the power is assigned the emissions profile of the renewable resource by California. So if California's treatment of renewable imports under the MRR is counting that emissions profile for electricity serving California load, then it's double counting if the RECs are used out of state. In that case, California is actually importing power with emissions and not assigning a compliance obligation. It's undercounting emissions and failing to address all of the emissions associated with imported electricity as it intends to do. At the same time, it creates a REC integrity issue for the states and voluntary programs using those RECs to transact zero emissions power. So California tries to draw this bright line between ARB's accounting rules and regulations and these retail-level load-based programs in the power sector. But there is an intersection, and it is at the point of imported electricity. So imported electricity is defined in the MRR and the cap and trade regulation means electricity generated outside the state of California and delivered to serve load inside the state of California. The regulation of the emissions associated with imported electricity under the cap and trade program is affecting load-based policies. We can argue whether or not it is load-based. I would say it is load-based based on that definition. But regardless, it's affecting load-based policies in the West because CARB is simply using a different tracking mechanism, energy delivery, than every other load-based program in the West, which uses the REC. So these sorts of inconsistencies and that raise double counting concerns and the uncertainty around them affect wholesale power markets, and this one in particular has important implications for participation in the EIM. We don't think the solution is to allow double counting. And I'll go ahead and say that this is what Mark called decoupling. If California is tracking emissions for imports with power and not using the REC, that's REC disaggregation. So coupling is just keeping the attributes together in the REC. And he said that coupling is negatively affecting or would negatively affect market efficiencies. I would just say that I think it's a false choice between accounting properly and maximizing the efficiency of the market. I don't think we have to double count to get regional benefits. I think it's a matter of policy design, and I go back to my earlier points about it not being the accounting instrument that's the problem. Double counting, damages market and program integrity and credibility in general. And double counting is really about whether the state policies are effective or not. Are they producing the intended outcomes, or is it just an artifact of flawed accounting? And ultimately, are these policies worth paying for? So finally, I think there are two problems: inconsistency between load-based policies in terms of whether the attributes are tied to the power and the tracking instrument that's used. This patchwork of policies that track GHG differently creates problems for the purposes of delivery to different states. And two, smaller state program boundaries. So policy boundaries are artificially limiting the regional market. So we think the right policies are those that don't double count, policies that match the market boundaries to the extent possible, and policies that make an incremental difference relative to others. That's it.
Thank you, Todd.
Was that way over?
A little bit over. Okay, so next we have Frank Harris from California Municipal Utilities Association.
All right, I'm going to set my timer. I feel like I'm giving testimony at CARB. Let's see, okay. There we go. So I appreciate, Jim, that you put a duck curve up there because I feel contractually obligated to put a duck up there as well. We know the Western EIM was designed to facilitate more efficient electricity market operations, and the big part of this, we've talked about this today, is more efficient dispatch, particularly environmental benefits, more efficient dispatch of renewable energy. Where I'm going to go with this is to say that I would advocate that we take more of a portfolio approach. And frankly, Mark, I think you buried your lead when you talked about how the environmental benefits of EIM are not currently being counted. To me, that's the big story. Benefits of EIM are significant, and these, by the way, this is not current data. I should have pulled it from the most recent quarterly report where, for example, we saw 22,000 tons of emissions savings due to avoided curtailment and $85 million in cost savings. But the lesson here is that the benefits of EIM are significant both in terms of dollars as well as environmental attributes. But let's think about it. We have probably have some traders here, or we work with traders. Think about what has to happen for your energy trader or your scheduling coordinator. Think what they have to do. They're asked to optimize the resource, find the most efficient dispatch. But in terms of considering the emissions associated with energy flowing into California, they're supposed to ignore that under optimization. They're supposed to not pay attention to that emissions cost, and essentially it begs the question, what is resource shuffling? Well, we know the definition, any plan, scheme, or artifice, yada, yada, yada. We've all read this. CARB's interpreted this to be not just inaccurate reports. I think, Jim, what you labeled this as being relabeling, how you characterized it as relabeling, but also the secondary emissions that occur beyond the California border due to imports into California. This creates such a problem of counterfactual, built on counterfactual, and built on counterfactual, that the tracking is really difficult. I understand why CARB's concerned about some of the secondary emissions due to market optimization. But the question is, can we create a scenario, can we imagine, a scenario which, due to the EIM, in which there could be negative secondary emissions? And this is, again, where I think, Mark, you buried the lead, because that's really what, in my language, you were talking about, is that secondary emissions are not just positive, they are negative. And if I go back, there they are. For the fourth quarter of 2018, I would characterize the secondary emissions, the negative secondary emissions due to EIM as being 10,000 tons. And somehow we need to be able to account for that to properly. The issue is that the optimal amount of carbon is not zero. We get a lot of socially wonderful things out of things that produce carbon. We have to hit our targets, but we don't want to artificially bias that target downward when we know that there are benefits that we could be accounting for. And so what I'm really advocating is that we take more of a portfolio approach in terms of incorporating the benefits of the EIM into our state-level policy decisions. The market is what it is. Accept that market is what it is, and identify the benefits that the market creates. And in terms of EIM, it creates tremendous benefits on the environmental space because we see fewer renewables being curtailed, and of course the economic benefits. There are some operational problems that EIM creates in a traditional sense. When we were talking about the source versus load, the point of regulation, when we first started the cap and trade in California, we thought about how are we going to do this with imports, and we thought, well, we can go through the E-tags. The E-tag can trace multiple transactions from the resource to the load. My understanding, and I'd be happy to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, is that the EIM transfers are done by a single balancing authority to balancing authority tag. And given that, and also since many balancing authorities span multiple states, this creates an accounting problem. But I think that the main lesson here is that the EIM creates tremendous benefits. State-level climate policies improve social welfare. The EIM facilitates more efficient dispatch and enables a greater volume of renewable energy, improves social welfare, but state-level climate policies challenge EIM optimization. And I would encourage the states to take more of a portfolio approach and realize they can best support climate change solutions by designing regulations that work with the broad energy markets and don't needlessly throw limitations on the market. I think I went 20 seconds over.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, thank you, and let's continue with the conversation with Eric Little from Southern California Edison.
Good afternoon. I am Eric Little from Edison, and I have to say this is the most people I've seen in an ISO conference room since we were debating price caps post-energy crisis. So if this half of the room could scream at that half of the room and vice versa, it will complete my moment of nostalgia, and I can shed a little tear. So I'll move on past the first slide because it really doesn't tell you much, and move on to the second one, which is this harmonization of state policy goals in a commodity market is not the easiest thing in the world to do, and you've heard a lot of descriptions about why so far. Energy is a commodity market. It is probably the one with the most constraints in it of any commodity market out there, and I'll be happy to stand corrected if that's not the case. But I think that it is. And when you throw another constraint in there, then we end up with another to deal with. As you've heard before, one of the big difficulties associated with this now is when you start getting multiple state policies involved. And so how do we reconcile those? Can you design an energy market to deal with that? Well, Mark showed you the math behind it, and I agree with him that the math behind it can indeed be done. Question is whether or not you get the granularity that you're really looking for out of it, and whether or not you really get the results that you're looking for out of it. I'm concerned about the potential of a market in which we say that there is a different GHG adder depending upon what state that comes from in a different amount, and now the LMP ends up being something that on one day is one price because you were deemed to have cleared and sold to state X, and the next day it's a different price because you're deemed to have cleared and sold to state Y. And at that point in time, LMPs, remember the L in LMP is locational. It's supposed to be what the value of energy at that specific location is. It's supposed to be a signal to generation of where to site and build if you're going to build a new generating plant. And if we start having those LMPs swapped because of who you're deemed to have sold, exported to, or stayed within the state, it becomes a lot more difficult to figure out exactly what that means. The other thing that has been debated quite a bit here is the different state policy goals, and I think that Mark was right. To the extent that you can get these things as close together as possible, the better off that we are. And while I don't imagine that all of the other states are going to come running to California to join ARB and join the cap and trade program that California has, if you want to do that, I'd be happy to stand corrected on that one as well. But if we're not going to go there, then what I would like to see is for the folks in the states with the policy objectives to get together and figure out what is good enough between two states that we can say, look, since you have your own policy and we have our own policy and we believe that those policies are sufficient enough to be alike, we're not going to deal with the secondary emissions between those different states. Because as Mark mentioned, it's been a big deal in California to try to get through with what happened with secondary emissions in another state, and as both Mark and Frank have mentioned, what happens when California is producing an excess of renewable that is actually reducing emissions from outside those states where it's not being accounted for. So I think it is incumbent upon all of the policy people in these various states to try to get together and come to agreement on whether or not those policies are consistent enough that we don't have to get the variety that Mark had up here with multiple different states, multiple different policies. We get to a band of people who are treating GHG in a similar manner and a band who are treating GHG in a different manner, whether that's not at all or some other policy mechanism. I think that's ultimately where we need to get to be able to make this workable in a commodity market, because otherwise the variety of prices on it and the impact to a commodity market, I think, is very difficult for that market to deal with. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Jeff Spires from PowerX. You guys are doing a great job.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Spires with PowerX. Today I'm going to be providing our perspective on some of the challenges associated with applying GHG programs to imports. I'll be touching on what I think are a lot of the same or similar themes to what some of the other presenters have discussed in the earlier today. For those of you that may not know PowerX, we're one of the most active participants in the physical wholesale energy markets across the West, in the bilateral markets, California day-ahead and real-time markets, and as of April last year, we're also in the EIM. We are the marketer for the residual capabilities of the BC Hydro system, and so we are also a seller of low-carbon hydro products. We also happen to be the only current EIM participant that is an asset controlling supplier as well. And just for myself personally, I'm not a policy person. I'm on the commercial team. I led our EIM implementation, and so a lot of our perspective is coming from the market and what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis participating in these markets. So first of all, I just wanted to start with what are some of the experiences we've gained to date with the existing California cap and trade program that we've been participating under over the last few years. And I think it's important to emphasize that even though there's the California market and there's the one program, there are multiple ways in which imports can be delivered into California. There's, of course, long-term resource ownership of out-of-state resources or other longer-term bilateral energy agreements. And in the short-term markets, there's both the existing bilateral energy market across the West, as well as now the organized market through the EIM. And so when we're talking about some of the challenges associated with tracking GHG of imports, it really is not specific to the EIM or specific to any other particular market. This is something we need to be looking at and considering in the context of all markets and all of the methods that imports to a particular region might occur. And so as others have mentioned, what is that challenge? And from our perspective, the challenge is how do you identify the specific resources that are being delivered and imported to California? And really that challenge, there's multiple elements to that. First of all, you have to have a principle for what is the right way to do that. In other words, if you've got an external seller, how do you determine which of their resources are used to meet their own load and which of their resources should be allocated as delivered to California? But once you've established that principle, then you also have to consider how is that actually tracked? How are the GHG emissions of the imports actually being accounted for in practice? And in the context of some of these existing markets, it might be e-tags, There's been discussion of RECs. It might be that the market software itself is deeming which resources are going. So there's multiple potential methods. And then I think lastly, really what we're trying to consider are what are some of the impacts if that attribution is inaccurate? In other words, who's benefited and who is harmed, or are there winners and losers? And I'll come back to that question shortly. This slide is just, I think, in the context of the discussion on EIM, but also given that organized markets, there's discussion of potential EDAM or growth in organized markets more generally. I just wanted to address some of the challenges that are perhaps unique to organized markets, or at least best illustrated by organized markets. So and this has been raised by others already, the organized market is a flow-based, centralized dispatch where the software itself is simultaneously determining all of the generation to meet all of the load across a really large footprint. And there is no explicit link between any one resource and any one load. And that's the fundamental challenge. And I think, it's worth just looking at this map. I know we've seen a number of different maps, but this is just a screenshot of the Eim Price Map, which generally speaking, each of the little dots on this map represents a generator or a load across the Eim footprint. And so I think that this is where, it's easy to kind of take a look at that map and ask yourself, well, what would be the right way to determine which green dot is California versus which green dot is meeting load outside of California? And that's fundamentally the challenge that we're faced with. And, to add to that, many of these resources are participating in other markets at the same time. And so they might be participating in the EIM, but they're also participating in the bilateral markets. So there's additional complexity on top of just within any one market structure on how are you making that determination. And, this has been a topic that has been discussed, and I know that CARB and the CAISO and other stakeholders have spent considerable time over the last few years trying to address some of the challenges in the EIM that have arisen over time and making efforts to make this as accurate as possible. But as was discussed in the morning, challenges continue to remain on the accuracy of this approach of identifying which resources were delivered to California. So just why do we care about this? I think there's a few things I just wanted to highlight briefly. First of all, I think clearly we want to make sure that we have accurate tracking of GHG emissions to ensure that we're getting the GHG emissions associated with the external resources accounted for correctly. I think that's the goal overall of the program. But just to add a little bit of detail, I think it goes somewhat beyond that, because we also want to ensure that the accountability of the GHG obligations is actually going to the right market participants and leading to the right price signals. In other words, the entities that are bringing clean supply to the market should be getting the benefits of getting the premium price for bringing a clean product to the market. And if you have an emitting resource, then you should bear the appropriate cost of those imports. And so really what we're talking about are, do the market signals ultimately encourage investing in clean resources, encourage market participation by those resources, but also critically, is it actually leading to the right dispatch? Because I know we've talked, and Mark mentioned earlier, that there's no perfect solution and there's trade-offs between an efficient dispatch and accurate GHG accounting. I agree that there's challenges, but I think there's also inefficiencies that are created by getting this wrong. And in other words, if you don't properly account for the GHG emissions of the resources that are being dispatched, you're ultimately dispatching the wrong resources. And that's one of the big problems, is we want to make sure that we get this accurate, because that actually does lead to the efficient outcome when you consider that part of that efficient outcome is selecting cleaner resources over emitting resources. And lastly, really what we're looking forward, and we're saying we're at a point now where We have multiple carbon jurisdictions that are developing. California cap and trade, BC has a carbon tax. Now we've got Oregon, Washington, New Mexico, and potentially others. The EIM is continuing to expand with new entrants coming on a regular basis, and discussion for the potential for a day-ahead market. And so given the complexity and the challenges we've faced to date, we really think it's time, and we would encourage this type of discussion to continue where regulators and participants can get together and start to consider what are the principles of a workable framework in the context of this growing complexity. In our view, we really think that starts with acknowledging the challenges we've faced to date in terms of some of the shortcomings that can occur with this resource-specific approach. And ultimately, if that isn't achievable, then we think we should take a step back from treating imports as resource-specific. If you can't do that accurately and that's not achievable, then we think that we need to look at different alternatives. And it could be including a more robust framework to verify whether imports are clean. But just to cap it off, we are optimistic that there are methods to do this, but we really think that we need to get together and continue to talk because consistency in at least some of the areas is going to be critical, as others have identified previously.
Thanks, Jeff. Claire Breidnich from Western Power Trading Forum will be our last stakeholder presenter, and then we'll transition to questions.
Okay. I'm Claire Breidnich, Western Power Trading Forum. Those of you who know me know that I have fairly strong views on most of the topics that are being discussed today, but I'm not actually going to share them with you right now. What I would actually like to do is kind of start teeing the discussion over to what do we do with all the different perspectives that we've just heard. And so there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight to take into account when we figure out how to take this process forward. The first is to consider what really is the range of either actions or involvement of the ISO itself or the market design in facilitating state carbon and clean energy policies. This list is not a comment on the policy desirability of any of these things, nor the technical feasibility before Don gets nervous back there, but just to recognize that there is a range, and that range is from none. And the example of that is the California Renewable Portfolio Standard and California's own 100% clean energy standard. That program is implemented entirely outside the EIM market because it relies on REC procurement and retirement alone. So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we have another California program, which is the cap and trade program, which has effectively been integrated into the algorithm itself, as Mark indicated, through the development of this greenhouse gas adder. And there's other things that we could anticipate. For instance, these issues that are coming up around the new clean energy programs in Washington, in New Mexico. One way you could think that those might go is we may end up with, you could foresee that we could end up with rules that if Washington implemented the program in a very restrictive way, that we're only going to treat RECs as valid under the program if the underlying power meets very specific requirements for either deliverability or if the power has not been deemed delivered into one of the cap and trade programs, California or Oregon, if it goes forward. So that would be another way that you could actually see some integration into the algorithm itself. You could alternatively, and I guess the functionality that I would see there is that you could see under that scenario that participating resources, if I'm a renewable resource operating in the EIM, I might say, to the ISO, we need more functionality to enable us to control where you consider the output of our resource being delivered. I want it to go to Washington, or I want it to go to Oregon. Even though we know deeming is a fiction in that we are effectively applying rules to determine where we assign power to, you could imagine that at the extreme, those sort of demands on the algorithm could ultimately lead to an outcome where you have the resources not dispatched because we can't deem them where you want to go. So these have consequences. An interim range would be that there's no integration in the algorithm and the states are simply relying on the ISO and data from the market to support implementation of the program. That could be something as simple as, you know, the volume of transfers between the BAs or the individual EIM entities, data to help determine what is the EIM system mix or on a per EIM entity system mix for emissions, as well as things we're already seeing with California's implementation, what are the resources that you're deeming delivered or the second batch. I also want to highlight a few process considerations. The first is, even though we've talked about 3 new state programs today, if Oregon's goes through, it's going to be in a much tighter time frame for implementation than the Washington program. I know Washington is proceeding very quickly with starting its rulemaking and thinking through how we get to a planning process. But if Oregon's cap and trade program is adopted, that's supposed to go into effect as of January 1, 2021. So that in and of itself to me suggests that Oregon program needs to be given some pretty high priority in terms of thinking through how this operates with the EIM. The other thing, and this begins to get into the question of what is the iterative process between the ISO stakeholder process and the states in figuring this stuff out. Because underlying a lot of these things are some real technical feasibility questions. And I don't know to what extent it's possible to know those all in advance. I mean, we know from EIM experience, as Jeff has highlighted, that there were unknown unknowns that caught up to us, and there may be more of those unknown unknowns. But one example here where I think there could be, it would be very important to get for Oregon is a very clear guidance from the ISO itself about the ability of being able to delineate the Oregon border for those Oregon EIM entities with balancing areas that cross that border, because that is fundamental to Oregon's decision of can we regulate EIM imports in a way that aligns with California's, because if they can't do that, then they can't implement it the same way that California can. So that's a pretty critical question. Similar questions I think could be directed to the ISO in advance for Washington's rulemaking in terms of, you know, what if we wanted to explore additional requirements for deeming delivery? Is that possible, or is that going to really screw things up? On the flip side of that, there's other cases where I don't think there's any point in going too far down the road of thinking about what additional changes we would want to see in the EIM design unless the states have made some decisions. Circling back around, and this is why it becomes iterative, what is the Oregon rule going to be for EIM imports? Is it going to align with California's, or is it going to be something completely different? If it doesn't align with California's, there may not be any need to modify the EIM. You could operate as is, and the state could use its own reporting processes to assign those emissions. That's a possibility. Another one is the question of whether Oregon and California link their programs, because that, I can't remember if it was Mark had cited this, but if those two programs link, then you have a common carbon price and the existing greenhouse gas adder works for both programs. If those programs don't link, we're looking at 2 separate greenhouse gas adders. These are getting into some of the more policy design questions and more of a sum up, I think, of some of the things you've heard today. I think a fundamental for questions for states, particularly as you get into your program design and rulemaking, is to really think hard about the extent to which you really need support or integration in the EIM implementing your program. And again here, California's program I cited a few minutes ago, the Clean Energy Standard is being implemented completely without the EIM. That's a possibility. My personal view, I believe EIM integration is far more important for programs that rely on a carbon price signal because of the ability of that price signal to influence dispatch. I am not convinced personally about the need for it for clean energy programs, and I think there are far more unsavory consequences that could arise from that if we go that route. But that's a question that I think states should give a lot of consideration to. You've heard a number of stakeholders and others today say that some of these ways that we could think about integration and design might actually impair further development of renewable resources, as well as the actual integration of those resources and could create disincentives of their participation in the market. In the overall scheme of things, if we're really trying to reduce emissions here, if you get a program that is very strict and achieves your goals in terms of deliverability or non-bundling or ensuring bundling of greenhouse gas attributes, but you lose the participation of renewable resources in the EIM, is that really a good thing? Then there's the question that a lot of us are raising about how sustainable are these changes if other states develop additional clean carbon and energy policies that are either similar to the existing programs or something completely different. And then the elephant waiting right outside the room, if we move to a day-ahead market, you know, what do we do with these programs and policies, and how do they integrate into the market if we move to day-ahead? The EIM algorithm and complexity problems I've raised. I think there's a tendency on the part of policymakers to think, the market will solve them out, or technology, if we dump enough resources and money in it, we can figure that out. I tend to trust the ISO on this. I mean, if they say this is really going to be problematic, I think we should take them seriously and think about the fact that there may be some real consequences in terms of the algorithm's ability to solve, I'm not going to go into prices because I don't know a darn thing about prices, but I've heard plenty of people say that there are consequences in terms of where you see the impacts in the market prices that are spit out, and that's a real question. And then lastly, we heard from Jordan and a few other, the commissioner from Utah, Idaho this morning, a few others. The concerns of the EIM entities in states that don't have carbon and clean energy policies is a serious issue. It's a serious issue because it goes to not only the willingness of those entities to participate in the market, but there's also potentially some legal issues there. I mean, we know California is, fortunately it's never come up, but we know that there have been a number of issues raised around Commerce Clause and discrimination issues, and I think being cognizant of those is going to be very important going forward, particularly as we contemplate additional changes that we might make.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, so we are going to transition to question and answer. As we do that transition so that everybody in the room is thinking of the questions that they have, I'm going to first turn to Jim and Mark and let them do one of two things. I'm going to give you options. You can either kind of a high summary of what do you think the bigger issues are that we have here today now that you've heard the panel, or if you have a specific question for any one of the panelists, go ahead and ask them that.
No, I really appreciate all the perspectives, and in a way it encapsulates my own perspectives, because at the end of the day, with the ISO, I think we try to be innovative and solution-oriented. This is a tough problem, and in regards to the additional changing environments in terms of the different state rules, the prospect of EDAM, I don't think we're so overly confident in what we're doing today is scalable or resolves all those issues going forward. So I agree we need to have a dialogue. I do agree that dialogue needs to be iterative, because we have to factor in what is feasible, what's doable, and we really need to kind of coordinate on what the overall objectives are. And I'm fairly confident that at the end of the day, whatever solution comes out of that, it may not be what we are doing today for EIM, and I think we all have to realize that. At the same time, we should recognize EIM is benefiting, both in terms of economic efficiency and GHG objectives, and so we want to be thoughtful about where we go next as we evolve, and we need to learn from what's going on today. And there's a lot of things that we can learn from. We've created a lot of information. We can mine that information, and we can learn from it and adapt going forward. Even with our recent change to address some of the concerns about secondary dispatch, I think we did that and we achieved some of those objectives, but we didn't fully uncover all the other consequences and unintended consequences, and we're still learning from that. So even though we got a higher accounting, a 2 times, 3 times accounting improvement of imports coming into California through the EIM, there's other things that we're dealing with. We're dealing with RTIO now, and we're dealing with what's still the residual secondary dispatch. So we have to factor all that in. not with the objective of stopping and saying we have to go back or not move forward. It's with the objective of let's move forward in a thoughtful way and meet the new objectives under the new paradigms of operation that we can achieve. And that's my pitch for openness to continue the dialogue.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of think out loud. So I have two sort of broad sets of thoughts, and one is in response to Todd's sort of raising the REC import issue. I'll get to that. But first I want to sort of be a contrarian, and I guess I was the one who started this, but pool-based markets, ISO markets, whatever you want to call them, they don't, as a rule, trace sources to destinations. Because there was no point in doing so. But that's not to say that they can't, and EIM is a really clever implementation of doing just that to essentially account for the fact that California values low carbon energy differently than other states, and it just is reflected in that dispatch. And so as a result, though, the clean energy is deemed delivered to California. That value is reflected there, and we have to sort of be confronted with the limits or implications of the fact that there's a bunch of generation that's being incremented in the EIM, and the cleanest stuff is going to California, and the other stuff's going someplace else. Now, I've been pondering Mark's multicolored map and the implications of it, because it does seem pretty scary, but in theory, at least, you could do all of that within the same framework where, say, New Mexico values carbon at $20 and California at $40 and Washington at $50 or whatever, and what would happen is the cleanest stuff gets delivered to the most states and so on, but it could, I think, in theory, be sort of just automated in the same way that we deal with it within the current EIM. What it does is expose the limits and maybe forces us all to confront the implications of what that really means. If we add to that, say, an RPS restriction, we could, in fact, say, hey, a state with a clean energy standard, they really value renewable energy, and so we're going to deem renewable energy delivered to Washington and low-carbon energy delivered to California, and it would force essentially a trade-off between those two things based upon how much each state sort of is implicitly valuing those attributes. It sounds kind of crazy, but the software basically would do it, and it would kind of expose on the margins what implicitly these policies are supposedly valuing each of these attributes for. And so technologically, maybe there's some secondary software stuff that's going to blow everything up. But, you know, conceptually, it seems like those sorts of things could be done, but it also maybe makes the policy seem almost, I don't want to come up with another adjective for that. Which is a segue to Todd's comments. I think what you're highlighting here, and it is a head scratcher, is the conflict between a regulation that is valuing carbon versus one that's valuing renewableness. And if, for example, the renewable energy was really dirty carbon-wise, then we wouldn't be sort of thinking about how weird that fact is. But the fact that we're bringing in this low-carbon energy and the ARB's regulations are focused on the actual emissions attributes of specific carbon, whereas other regulations are focused on the renewableness of them, they are, in a sense, separable, but, you know, your sort of presentation highlights how it's kind of not working in the way we thought the renewable portfolio standards are supposed to work. So I do think there should be a common sense, but not probably perfectly, elegantly clean solution to that could get us there. But it does help to highlight the fact that, you know, an RPS is a blunt instrument for trying to deal with carbon in the sense that we don't actually know, or there's a lot going on in terms of what the carbon abated from a megawatt of renewable energy might actually be at any given point in time. So we have to sort of think about how we're willing to trade off these two different types of climate policies in terms of what they measure. there is this real appeal to an RPS in the sense that it can be separable and can really reconcile multiple states' policies that have different goals associated with them. We would have to come up with an accounting system that's able to handle many different flavors of RECs because different states value different stuff in different ways. But the RIN market in biofuels kind of does that. Maybe it's not the best example. It has had its problems, but it's kind of working. The difference, though, is that an RPS is forcing people to buy positive quantities of stuff, and it becomes binding when there's not enough stuff out there for everybody to buy what they're required to buy. And that sort of lends itself to this sort of system of tracking a separable attribute-based certificate that I'm not sure there's an analog in a carbon regulation world, although I'm now motivated to think about if there could be. So that's a long set of things. I mean, I guess I will phrase this as a question for Todd. Like, you know, I can see why you're raising this. I can see, you know, the other side of it. It could either be a criticism of ARBs or it could be a criticism of the RPS itself in terms of it seems like a conflict at the root of trying to regulate the same problem with two different instruments, and it's sort of the poster child of where those two things come into conflict.
I would almost add more bluntly, I mean, if you've got a zero carbon resource in the Northwest or Mid-Sea or whatever the picture was, and it's capturing a marginal price in a clearing market, then in many hours we'll include a carbon adder. And then it's counting that same energy towards a compliance obligation in a completely different area. I'm having a hard time reaching the same conclusion. That's an ARB regulatory issue.
All right, can I, all right, cool. I appreciate the feedback. So to respond to first Professor Bushnell's question, so I mean, to the extent that there was a question about whether or not a REC included the GHG emissions, the direct GHG emissions associated with that resource, so the emissions profile of that resource, we kind of began that discussion, I think, at the Regional Issues Forum in 2017 when I first presented this problem. But to the extent that we were sort of talking about that, I don't think we are anymore, and that's thanks to the introduction of these carbon-free power policies that we see in Washington and New Mexico. So we can talk about the differences between RPS, measured in megawatt hours, delivering renewables to customers versus delivering, counting counting the emissions profile of a zero emissions resource in California under the MRR. But now that we have carbon-free power standards, which are essentially, RPSs for carbon that are using RECs as the accounting mechanism for that policy, there really is, we're doing carbon accounting based on RECs. So I'm not sure if it's worth talking about whether or not RECs include this attribute anymore to the extent that there is a question, because ultimately it's sort of common sense to me. I'm not sure you can disaggregate fuel type from emissions. The fuel type determines the emissions. It makes no sense to a customer that they're receiving wind power with emissions. It just doesn't, I'm not sure how you separate those things. So ultimately for me, it comes down to, again, we're talking about tracking attributes. I agree with what Claire said, that deeming is a fiction. If we can all agree that we can't deliver electrons from the point of generation on a shared grid to a point of consumption, then it's a choice. It's a choice about how we track these attributes to customers. Now, we have this system that we've used across the country, but certainly across the West historically for RPS, but also in the voluntary market of RECs, which we've used as the way, at least to transact specified renewable power for the purposes of verifying the delivery of that power to customers. And there's definitely an argument to be made that those are that states use those as policies to address emissions in their state. California is very explicit that the RPS is a mechanism that it uses to you know, in the scoping plan to reduce emissions in the state, complementary to cap and trade. But to the extent that, you know, we have a system that is separate from the power, where these attributes are bundled together and tracked and verified, if we all of a sudden use or introduce a policy that doesn't use that instrument, then the problem becomes that we have two different tracking mechanisms for tracking attributes. And I would argue that it's not worth it to unbundle those attributes, because then you get into this sort of nonsensical outcome of having wind without emissions or emissions without fuel type. But it's a matter of all getting on the same page about how we're going to track those emissions. And if you look at the East Coast, we have all generation certificate tracking systems. All the states use, you know, that are within that region, use that tracking system for things like power source disclosure. We could use Regis in very much the same way. And in that case, it would be a matter of CAISO communicating more, you know, with Regis in terms of identifying the RECs associated with power that's imported into California. So, you know, I'm not an ideologue about RECs. You know, I'm not arguing that RECs are, you know, necessarily in and of themselves. I'm saying RECs are a tool that we've historically used to allocate, you know, power to customers where that's physically not possible. And if we use a different mechanism for doing that, then we end up with a scenario where there's a potential for double counting. And I don't think double counting is required in order to realize the regional benefits or the regional efficiencies of an organized market.
Thanks, Todd.
Sure.
I'm going to give a chance for I'm going to let one other panelist do a quick response, and then I want to get to the audience because I've promised them they get to ask questions.
Todd, you and I talked about this quite a bit. I used to be heavily involved in Regis when it first started out, and I advocated that we have an all-generation tracking system. As you know, I lost that fight. But if the fuel type determined the emissions, then we wouldn't need to be talking about secondary emissions under California's cap and trade. Clearly, the cap and trade does not agree with your statement. The fuel type does not determine emissions. Okay, based on EIM or other imports, the reshuffling problem that Jim was talking about is pure evidence of that. And so we have to sort of pick our poison here, right? And I agree with Tony. I don't think that ARB's the problem here. And while you were talking, I actually opened up the Regis website to make sure I didn't miss something. No, there's nothing. None of the data files consider GHG attributes on the Regis certificate. And so that's. I think ARB is not the problem.
Okay, so Todd, I know you want to respond, and I'm going to stop. Because I think our goal here is to flag some issues. Let's flag issues and things that we know that we need to have more conversation about. So certainly this issue about the role of the REC and the carbon accounting is an important issue. I'm going to turn to the audience and see if they have questions for any one of the panelists. Yes, okay.
Thanks. Carl Sakella, NRDC. It seems like really the issue is that there are different approaches that are being followed. And if we could somehow find a way to make those congruent, we could choose. You can pick your poison, but everybody's got to agree on what the poison is. And it seems to me that's the challenge. We've got better alignment in the West than we've had at any time since the Western Climate Initiative. Well, maybe it's time to think about reconvening something like that to come up with and address some of these issues and give people a chance to find some consensus. We can't change the statutes that have been adopted, but maybe what we could do is have some congruence in the implementation across those different platforms. So it seems to me that's an issue that we ought to be looking at while we have this great alignment, when we have the opportunity to meet these very ambitious goals. A lot of people have a dog in the same hunt, almost exactly the same goals, if not, precisely so. It just seems like there's a good opportunity to look at the policy context of how to do that.
Thanks, Carl. There's a comment, right, kind of identifying. Great. Terrific, thank you. I think there was another question or comment over here. I thought I saw a hand. Oh, did I miss? Okay. I'm going to give them a moment. There's one. Go ahead, Glenn.
This is Glenn Blackman from the state of Washington, and I think this question is for Professor Bushnell. I wonder about the possibility that, it looks to me like the EIM is trying to trade two products in one market, clean power and dirty power, and struggling a lot with trying to do that. And it seems like organized markets usually try to trade a single homogeneous product. And might there be a solution that where we have two markets, one for clean power, one for dirty power? And by clean power, I would include emitting resources that come to the market having paid for their allowance or whatever they need to do to be clean, and not try to, within one market, make all these adjustments for different attributes of the product being traded.
It's a good question, and I think it's a good way for me to jump in on the previous discussion as well, which I was sort of chomping to do. And I think you're kind of getting at this issue of what is it we're trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve a certain target of clean energy, or are we trying to reach a certain target of low carbon, let's say it's not zero, or let's say it is zero. Are we trying to ultimately reach a certain carbon target? And they're very strongly correlated, but they're not exactly the same thing. And so if we try to do them separately, we're giving up the opportunity to trade off one type of carbon reduction tool with the other. And that would be the concern. And I think the earlier discussion is kind of reflecting that too, that we can track how much zero carbon energy there's created and where it's going and that sort of stuff, but that's not the same thing as what the carbon emissions avoided are, because 1 kilowatt hour of clean energy avoids a certain amount of dirty energy at different times. Places, and ultimately it's a rough proxy for, I think, what we really want to get to, which is some certain type of carbon emissions total. Now, given politics and all the other stuff, it seems to be maybe an easier pathway to trying to push clean energy policy. But I think this whole discussion and concepts of trying to do both things simultaneously sort of ultimately run into the question of, well, what are the trade-offs? How much are we willing to pay for watt hour of clean energy? And it sort of comes back to, well, it kind of depends on how much carbon we're avoiding with that clean energy, which sort of leads me to think we do want to try to do it all together. But we do want to somehow come up with an attribute scale that matches what we're ultimately trying to achieve, which is where kind of carbon emissions fit in, which is a long-winded answer. But I can see the attraction to it, and that is in essence what I think we're doing. We're almost simultaneously pushing these two parallel markets. But that has problems in the sense that there are limits to how much just a blunt instrument of clean, not clean can do for us.
Thanks. Mark, I'm going to ask a question while I'm looking through the room. So it's come up a couple of times, this idea that maybe it's a pool, just resources and loads, and you can't get the specificity of what resource was dispatched to serve which load. Jim kind of suggested, oh, maybe you can. What are your thoughts within kind of the thoughts of the algorithm and, what can happen within a 5-minute time step and all of those kind of things about the ability to get to specificity?
I think if it was just state price differential and everything else was source-based, I think, yeah, theoretically you could achieve it from a technological perspective. I think where it starts breaking down further for me is when you then have like this discussion right now with the point of regulation and the combining up or the coupling of the clean attribute with the GHG, and I think that coupled on top of different regimes across the West could that's where it gets really cloudy for me how you achieve it. So if it was just price and there was a price difference, I don't really like it, and I don't know if there are I don't know if there's implications of that, but I can see how the map could work with multiple adders for every state. And again, I don't know if there's other implications of that, but I think it could work.
Yeah.
Sorry, that just made me think about something. You said you could conceivably see how it would work if you had multiple adders from multiple states. Could it conceivably work, though, if you had adders for some states which were actually priced into settlement and adders from other states where it wasn't actually priced into settlement? Because that's the challenge I see when you get to the clean energy type programs. We're not, what we're effectively talking about is a subsidy on generation. That's how you could look at the REC. And if you've got, if you've got resources that are already bidding zero into the market in terms of their power prices, how do you capture that subsidy in the dispatch decision, particularly when the states itself aren't going to want to pay additional prices for it because those utilities are already paying for it through the REC?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
The answer is no.
I don't know. I still, I think it goes back to my earlier discussion. I think I see how the RECs are getting incorporated into the dispatch today. They're coming in through the bids, but I don't have to track where that REC is going. Okay? The REC accounting is separate from that tracking. It doesn't mean it doesn't change the dispatch. It does change the dispatch because obviously those renewable resources with the RECs are going to bid zero or negative, and they're going to be dispatched more frequently than other ones that have higher costs. So I think that achieves that objective. But if you start tracking the REC where it's going, and I guess back to Todd's concern, I think there's a perception that, well, if the GHG tracking associated with that resource goes to California, somehow the REC goes with it. And I'm just saying today it doesn't. That the REC doesn't go with that resource. No one's picking up that REC accounting for that resource that is attributed for GHG purposes coming to California. So I guess there's a double counting concern. I don't fully understand that, but I guess I also feel that there's also a potential missed accounting. You lost the accounting of a REC resource because no one's taking credit for it, and I think that's all.
Yeah, I think, it's easier to envision this if it's all some kind of carbon accounting and all some kind of downstream load-based delivery that you're trying to track. You can mix that with sources someplace. But when you start mixing in a zero carbon attribute with that, then, yeah, the market solution becomes probably possible. But if you've got the RECs happening outside of the market, then that becomes really hard to see how that plays out.
I think it's only a problem because we're doing it two different ways. So again, it goes back to my point that I don't think that there's something inherently challenging about using the RECs to track these attributes, but there is something challenging about having the value of that specified resource tracked in a REC and also included in the bid at the same time in order to allocate power to California to decide, how specified resources are deemed delivered to California for its policy. So again, it goes back to this challenge of having two different mechanisms for doing the same thing. I just wanted to also respond that with respect to the statement about fuel type not determining emissions. So I'm trying to wrap my brain around that. And you sort of pointed to resource shuffling I think what you're talking about is avoided emissions, and I think that goes back to something that Professor Bushnell just talked about. I think there is an important distinction between the direct emissions profile of a resource and tracking that to state versus the avoided emissions associated with renewable generation. There are two different types of GHG accounting there, so it goes back to program objectives, which is also something that we've been talking about. And this question about whether or not CARB is the problem. I think the problem is inconsistency among states. I think the REC system was pre-existing at the time that we created the rule about how we do the accounting for specified imports in California, and there was an opportunity at that time to align these accounting methodologies. I think, the idea that this is source-based and doesn't impact the REC, is what sort of ultimately is sort of how we moved forward without including the REC. And I think we've seen that regardless of that perspective, it's impacting REC markets, right? And so it is having an effect on load-based policies. There is double counting concern. We are going to have to make this decision about what to do with the RECs associated with California imports. Other programs are going to have to make that decision. So
okay, I'm gonna stop, if I can stop you for a minute. I want to see if there are questions in the audience about any other issue for a minute, and then I'm going to let all the panelists respond. Okay, so I'm going to let all the panelists respond, but I want to see if there's questions in the audience or on the phone on a different issue. Not to say this one's important. We had a whole risk forum on this topic, so we know it's important. Yeah. Nobody in the room?
Lenny, do we have any questions on the phone?
We do have one caller in queue.
Thank you.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks. This is Bonnie Blair. I represent a group of cities in Southern California that are very active in ISO stakeholder initiatives. This question really is I think for Mark Rothleader or Jim Bushnell, and the question is, a couple of folks have mentioned the potential impacts on the extension of the day-ahead market. And my question is, do you have a sense whether the challenges would simply be bigger in scale because the day-ahead market affects 90% of the energy transactions, at least to serve California load, and EIM is, roughly 10%, or would the challenges be different in nature as well?
This is Mark. I think it is scale, but it's not just scale, because I think when you go to the day-ahead market, it's effectively the first market that's being cleared. And so unlike EIM, where you have a base schedule that says, hey, but for the EIM, this is how I'm serving my load, you don't have that piece of information in the day-ahead market. And I think because of that, I think that plus the scale, I think it leads you to potentially a different solution than just what is EIM doing. Now, will it have components of what we've done in EIM? Potentially, but it also may need to be a different solution. And I think we have to be open to what is the right fit for an EDAM situation where, again, it's scale, it's kind of you're doing the 100% clearing, but it's also you don't have this basis for knowing what is, but for the EIM, what is serving the load externally. That's the problem.
So you don't have that counterfactual, or not the counterfactual, but the pre-existing condition.
Yeah. Right. So the idea of secondary dispatch just doesn't exist anymore because it becomes the first. And so a lot of where we've resolved the tracking of the effects of EIM has been based on that difference, and there wouldn't be this baseline.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Now, what I'd like to do, because we've heard a lot from Mark and Jim and also from Todd, I want to give the rest of the panelists an opportunity to respond. So you guys can just self-select your order. I think Mary was wanting to respond, but go ahead, and what I'll ask you to do, because this will be how we'll wrap up this panel, is to go ahead and either comment on something you heard that you thought was really interesting, or if there was something in this conversation about the role of RECs related to carbon counting and kind of what the objective is, to feel free to give your comment on that.
So I don't want to sort of high center on this question of RECs versus carbon accounting. This scenario or this example of a renewable resource outside of California being deemed delivered to California is a real one. PacifiCorp's wind resources are not allowed to be deemed delivered to California in the EIM because of this issue. And we would more so agree with kind of the that it's not a double count, but in conversations with our state policymakers, we decided that they probably would think that. So having that kind of certainty, pick your poison, one way or the other, I think is something that, would be helpful. But I also just think that this is one example, and I think as we see states with more policies, you're going to see sort of a proliferation of these kinds of examples. Now solar resources in California don't want to be deemed delivered to Washington because it will be, if it's reported as zero emitting to Washington, then now that REC is unusable for California RPS compliance, or to Oregon or to New Mexico. I mean, you have a proliferation of these issues. This is just one example. And I think what I would really like to see, I like the Carl's suggestion of kind of a regional dialogue on this, because the outcome, it is not a positive thing for PacifiCorp's resources not to be fully engaged and fully participating in the market because of this issue. And we don't think that there are negative environmental consequences right now, but there could be. You could see a scenario where now people don't want to participate in the market because they're going to lose their RECs. Or, now people the resources aren't being fully utilized and making the achievement of these policies more difficult. So I do think that, I don't think we should get high-centered on, well, this state needs to change their policy or that state needs to change their policy. I'd really like to see kind of a dialogue on this, because it's going to be very consequential for the cost and ability for entities like PacifiCorp to comply with 5 different versions of these policies.
Eric?
Yeah, so I tend to agree with Mark that the math can be worked out. You can figure out the calculations, but that really just brings us to 2 more questions, in my mind at least. First question is whether or not the systems can solve that problem in a sufficient amount of time. You're adding a lot more data, a lot more complexity, so the question is, can it solve? And I leave that to the ISO and their IT team to figure out whether or not the software can do it. The other question, though, that it leads to is, even supposing that you could make those calculations, what information does that actually provide to the market? Does it provide you better information about the value of energy at any given point, or does it start to look a little bit more like a random number generator? And I think we need to think through both of those problems to figure out whether or not this really makes sense to do it in some sort of a mathematical manner. That's aside from all the questions of how do you consolidate all the different programs and get it to have meaning and such forth. But I think that, yes, the math can solve it is not the final answer of that. I think you have to answer those 2 other questions along.
Okay, thanks.
The thing I was thinking about, I mentioned this a little bit when I was standing up, is that I would encourage in this dialogue, I love the way you characterize this, that that's what we need. I would encourage state-level policymakers to accept the market as being external to their calculus, that it exists. Engineers don't try to manipulate gravity when they design a building. They respect gravity and they design a building in accordance. And I think that's kind of the approach that I would encourage sub-regional policymakers to take. There are significant portfolio benefits if we can do that. Mark mentioned them, and I mentioned them, and I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg. I think there are significant portfolio benefits environmentally, economically, if we can do that.
First of all, I very much appreciate Professor Bushnell's insights and expertise into market design and the discussion about what is potentially possible in an organized market with respect to accounting for GHG. I think for us, really, what we're faced with is contrasting that type of discussion with the practical reality and some of the outcomes that we've experienced over the last few years, and some of the challenges that are known to be existing not only in the EIM but just in the wholesale markets more generally with tracking GHG for imports. And so I think my conclusion is very similar to what Mark Rothleader said at the beginning of his comments, which is it's really important that we take a look at what's gone on to date and we learn from that, and that we move forward thoughtfully and carefully and collaboratively, and be open to new approaches on methods to account for imports into the GHG regions that are continuing to grow. And perhaps as part of that, considering more simple approaches to achieving that, given that the number of policies and regions is growing and the overall complexity of the markets is growing. So it seems like the time is now to further those discussions.
I'm an independent consultant, and all I can say is I've got job security for a while. It's interesting that WCI has come up a couple of times today, and because one of the things that I think back to the WCI process is the whole concept of FJD came out of the WCI process. And this is, I guess, a plea to the states to think about this and think about your stakeholders. I mean, the fact that we came up with FJD was fundamentally based on considerations of how to best integrate cap and trade into the markets in the West, and I'll say markets writ large in the West because of the diversity there. And so I think that alone demonstrates the value of having these discussions frequently and early with market participants. I think there's on this panel we've got a pretty divergent view of opinions about what the correct approach is. Certainly Todd and I and each end of the table have different views on this, and I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. But I do think it does maybe 3 or 4 points we agree on. I think it is an attestation that we really do need to have these conversations and be having them on an ongoing basis pretty much immediately starting today.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm grabbing the mic one more time. I had a thought about double counting that I wanted to just throw out there. This is dangerous of me. I know, I'm sorry. But it speaks to the broader issue of just overlapping policies. So we have simultaneous climate policies that all address some of the same sectors, and it's low carbon fuel standard in gasoline as much as it is renewable electricity standards and cap and trade as well. They interact with each other, and so if we have additional renewable electricity, it lowers the carbon price. And so is that double counting then, or is it 1.5? I think there's complicated interactions there that make it somewhere between single and double counting, I think. But, I'd have to ponder that a little more. But I do think part of the issue here, double counting is cleaner if it's the same thing that we're counting. And if it's sort of slightly related things, then it becomes a more complicated question.
So
I would make the argument that we're counting the same thing, and that's how I would define double counting. So your example, I wouldn't call that double counting. I would say that those are complementary measures in that case. And there's an argument to be made, especially if you're thinking about the voluntary market. We often talk about this idea of regulatory surplus, right? It's important to voluntary demand that they're going above and beyond what's required by law. So we think about we would think about that sort of thing in terms of, okay, a voluntary renewable energy procurement doesn't want that renewable energy to be used for any compliance purposes because they want to be making a difference. And you can think about RPS in the same way, I guess, with respect to cap and trade, except I don't think there's any expectation on the part of the RPS ratepayer that their payment for the RPS produced benefits above and beyond cap and trade. I think the state has presented those two programs as complementary and working together towards meeting the goals, and you can see that in the scoping plan. They say, like, look, the RPS has produced this amount of emissions reductions, and that means that cap and trade acts as a backstop. So I guess you could make the argument that RPS sort of subsidizes compliance on behalf of the fossil generator as paid for by the RPS ratepayer. But I don't think we're thinking about it that way. When we were talking about the Clean Power Plan, it was certainly presented that the RPS could be a way to factor it into your Clean Power Plan. So I wouldn't call that double counting. I would call those sort of complementary effects. What I am thinking of is actually counting the same thing in different places. I'm talking about the direct emissions associated with electricity generation, and that's ultimately what I'm concerned about. I think this question about regional market efficiencies and whether or not we should tolerate some amount of double counting to realize those benefits, and whether or not it's good for existing renewable resources to be able to avoid a compliance obligation in California at the same time as they sell the RECs into an RPS program, and whether that provides more benefits for renewable energy than separating those two things and making sure that each policy is incremental is an interesting question. I just think all other things being equal, you get more renewable energy if you don't double count, and ultimately double counting speaks to the effectiveness of policies, and policymakers are going to want to make sure that their policies are producing real outcomes because they're asking customers to pay for those policies. And so, again, I don't think we have to choose between accounting properly and getting these regional benefits. I think it's a matter of policy design, and that comes down to bundling requirements, whether the attributes are separate or tracked with the energy, and it comes down to market boundaries. So if we can set those things properly, I think we can account properly, and I think accounting's important in this case for EIM participation.
Great. Thank you, Todd. Thank you to the panel, the full panel, and to Mark and to Jim. I'm not going to let anybody get up. You're going to clap in a little bit. So I just want to do some summarizing and all of that before we lose all of you. A couple of things we heard. Themes today, right? Themes today. The EIM has value. People don't want to negatively impact that value, and the utilities that have states with carbon policies or carbon reduction policies, accounting programs, they want to be in compliance with those, right? So those we know kind of consistently throughout the day. And then probably Claire's kind of pointed messages, we need to be talking about this, and we need to be talking about it across the states, not just within our state, but across the states and with the market operator and the market participants. So we're super excited that this had the turnout that it did today, that it proved to have the rich conversation that it did. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about still. We're open to hosting conversations through the Regional Issues Forum if that's what's decided. We know decision-making happens at state rulemaking and at CAISO stakeholder processes, but if there's still a little bit more to flesh that out, we can do that. A couple of last things about this meeting. All of the PowerPoint presentations are posted on the website, so you can find the PowerPoint presentations there. I will take the moment to advertise that Tuesday, August 27th, is the next Regional Issues Forum meeting. The agenda will also be posted on the website, so you can find it there. I really do want to thank all of the Regional Issues Forum liaisons. They are key in actually identifying this topic, helping us to set the agenda, finding the speakers for this. This was not it was a 10% effort. So I just want to thank all of them for that. And again, thank you to our panelists, and thanks for being here today.
I want to add one more thank you to Therese for conceiving of this idea and bringing all of you people together. I don't think we would have had this productive conversation without tireless efforts at calling and organizing and getting people on the phone to hash out what is going to be said and get coordinated on what was said. And also to the ISO for hosting us and doing all the logistical work. Nikki and Peter also facilitated a lot of those conversations. And so please join me in thanking these.